Estamos de volta, minha gente, e eu, Mônica Iose, trago para vocês agora o nosso próximo super conteúdo. Para isso, eu resolvi vir aqui, conhecer esse nosso palco ao ar livre, porque nós vamos falar de economia limpa. Mas você sabe o que é isso? Eu, para falar a verdade, tenho assim uma vaga ideia. Mas o pessoal da AXA Investment Managers vai explicar para a gente direitinho, tudo tintim por tintim, daqui a pouco. Só que agora eu quero saber se você aí de casa já conheceu todos os conteúdos do nosso palco parceiros aqui na Expert XP 2021. Não? Tem que conhecer, né, gente? Agora a gente vai começar a nossa live, mas se eu fosse você, daqui a pouquinho, depois que tudo terminar, eu ia dar uma voltinha para conhecer tudo aqui, vale muito a pena. Afinal, a Expert é o maior festival de temas ligados a investimentos e é só aqui, nos 6 palcos da nossa cidade digital, que você fica sabendo o que pensam as mentes que transformam o mundo. Bom, pessoal, os nossos próximos palestrantes falam com a gente direto do Reino Unido, porque a gente é muito chique, né? A Expert, além de digital e imersiva, é um evento global e sem fronteiras. Então agora, com vocês, Amanda O'Toole e Jeremy Gleason, da AXA. Expert XP 2021. Investir em conhecimento transforma o futuro.
Hello, everyone. I'm Guilherme Anversa, Portfolio Manager in XP Advisory. And today we are pleased to talk with Amanda O'Toole and Jeremy Gleason from AXA. AXA is a global leader in investment, managing over $1 trillion. It's a very well-known company for its ability to invest in innovation and disruptive assets, especially in technology, clean energy, and biotech. Both are based in London. Jeremy Gleason, he started his career in 1997. He joined AXA in 2007. He's the portfolio manager for the digital economy strategy. This fund is already available for investors in XP platform. And Amanda O'Toole is the lead investment manager for clean economy strategy. This strategy will be available in a few weeks in our platform. Amanda joined AXA in 2010. She began her career as an investment analyst in emerging markets, energy, and consumer companies. So thank you, Amanda and Jeremy, for your time with us today. Today we will talk about evolving towards to a clean and digitally connected society. Our society is changing rapidly. Business everywhere are undergoing profound transformations, and AXA task is to identify these companies that are in forefront in this innovation. I would like to start our conversation today talking about future. And if you use our imagination, I'll start with Amanda. Can you please paint us a picture of the future, where innovation will lead us?
Sure. Thank you very much for having us. It's really good to have the opportunity to speak with you about these things. In terms of the future, I think looking at climate change and the energy transition and some of the clean technology solutions that I look at, we often spend quite a bit of time thinking about the risks, the threats. There's obviously an awful lot reported in terms of the dire consequences of exceeding a 1.5 degree temperature increase, and the pace at which we need to invest globally in order to mitigate those risks. And I think actually increasingly we're starting to see some of the implications, some of the extreme weather events which are impacting harvests, which are sort of damaging infrastructure, housing, and starting to have an impact directly on people's lives. So I think it's quite easy to think when we look to the future as to some of those risks and the very obvious both economic and human costs associated with some of these problems. But actually, on the flip side, there is so much innovation, sort of almost by virtue of the prescient problems that we're seeing. There has been a huge rush by corporates and consumers to start to commit to make changes. So we look at the really huge leaps that we've seen in terms of net zero commitments from corporates globally. So we're now at 68% of global GDP sits under some sort of a commitment in this area. And what that means is that the companies that can provide solutions that can help us to avoid further emissions, etc., are really prepared to invest. And so the pace of innovation is happening really, really quickly. Take a simple example, something like electric vehicles, which is one of the obvious parts of the future, I think. About 3 million electric vehicles were sold in 2020. We think that by 2040, 66 million passenger vehicles sold each year will be electric. So that'll be 2/3 of all passenger vehicles. So when we think about the future, we'll not be buying petrol, we'll be buying electric vehicles. But I think more interestingly, actually, we as consumers will be differentiating between the good and the bad. An electric vehicle will just be a car. And what we will be considering as consumers is the miles that car was shipped, the way its materials were produced, the extent to which mining was sustainable, the way that the OEMs providing the vehicle are managing the end of life. So I think we will, as individuals, as consumers, be thinking much more holistically about what it means for a vehicle to be sustainable. And I think we'll see that thread passing through all of our individual spending decisions. So, it's easy to think about renewable energy in terms of clean technology and that being a really big step forward. But actually, that's happening. Renewables are the cheapest form of new energy to be producing usually. So that won't be what we're thinking about. It will be much more the extent to which we can make our homes smart, our offices can be more sophisticated, our energy efficiency measures will be vastly improved so that some of these problems are mitigated. We'll see these decisions through food, through reduced waste, through the adoption of precision agriculture, and so on and so forth. So I just think when we look to the future, I think we as individual consumers will be much more empowered to make decisions about the sustainability of the products we consume. And that's where I would see us in 10 years from now.
Jeremy, same question for you. What is this digital world for the future?
Sure. And likewise, I would like to just say thank you very much to XP for hosting us here today and letting us represent AXA Investment Managers at your event. We feel very proud and privileged to be able to do that. The future of the world. Sometimes with looking at the technology sector, I have to make sure that I'm checking myself and making sure I'm focusing on science fact and not science fiction. There's always so many exciting things happening, so many promises being made for the future that you have to make sure that you're not chasing down niches or fads, but still focusing on the mainstream within what technology is going to deliver and provide and improve in the future. So there's going to be constant innovation. And I always think that technology is about evolution rather than revolution, but there's going to be constant improvements around e-commerce. A lot of us have used e-commerce more than we ever have done over the last 18 months. Some people have had their first e-commerce experiences in the last 18 months, but e-commerce can get simpler. It can get better for the consumer. It can be safer by reducing the friction. And increasing the security. I think that we're starting to see elements of what the power of the cloud and cloud computing can do for our everyday lives and for businesses around the world. And I think the cloud will only get more powerful, and the utility of that cloud will only become more apparent over time. And that will lend itself to applications which might not have been feasible once before, such as machine learning and artificial intelligence, technologies which require a huge amount of computing power, which wasn't able to be supported just by the type of computing power that a company could have on its own premises, unless you were a government-backed agency. But by doing it in the cloud, it becomes far more feasible for many businesses to get access to machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I think that one of the big things of the future, which we're only just starting to start to see some emergence of, but we'll see much more of this over the coming year, is around 5G technologies, and the impact that will have on us, our businesses, the way we interact. Without going into sort of too much technical detail, or without wanting to oversimplify how complicated cellular networks are, 3G networks, revolutionized, or was a massive evolution from 2G for the use of data. But 3G networks were still very voice-centric. 3G standards were developed when people felt that the primary use of a mobile phone was for us to speak to one another. 4G networks were a huge advancement for data, but was more of a software upgrade on those 3G networks, which were still very much voice-centric. So these 5G standards, which we're now starting to see deployed for the first time, are the first time where a cellular communications infrastructure has been built for a data-first world. And that's just going to open the door to applications being built in that data-centric world, which just weren't feasible in the past. So once again, I go back to machine learning and artificial intelligence, touching upon the types of devices that are out there, which have historically been passive, but will become smarter because of the use of the cloud. And actually that goes full circle back into Amanda's world of the automotive industry, where we will start to see smart vehicles, which ties in very nicely with the electrification of vehicles, where these vehicles will be safer for us as drivers, safer for those around us when we're driving, and ultimately will become much more efficient uses of our time. And 5G is very much at the heart and importance of all of that.
And Jeremy, with all this massive transformation in technology, can you explain overall how you find opportunities in your market?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I guess that kind of ties into our investment process, which is a combination of thematically driven investments, but also a lot of bottom-up research and just legwork that we have to do to find those opportunities. I guess first of all, we have to have a passion about what we're looking at. If we don't have that passion about what we're looking at to invest in, then it makes life more difficult for us. And then once you have that passion, you can spend a lot of time speaking to people who are in the industries that you're interested in. The people who are living this on a day-to-day basis, the people who are working in companies who are developing, groundbreaking technology, which is going to be used in a variety of different means. So speaking to management teams, really important. Speaking to people who are in research industries, who are developing products or looking at all the variety of different opportunities out there and trying to gauge how large these opportunities are, and then who are going to be the successful businesses who are going to participate in those opportunities over the longer term. Because once again, these aren't about us chasing niches and fads. It's about us identifying long-term opportunities driven by these themes, which can make our investors money over the long period.
And Amanda, in your side, how do you find these opportunities in the clean economy part, talking more about your portfolio?
I think the process is very similar. Like Jeremy, I think we come from a starting point of caring deeply about the areas of the world that we're looking at. And Jeremy and I are very, very fortunate that we spend our days learning about parts of the world that are really changing and that directly impact all of our lives day in, day out, and where we can sort of witness the benefits of the innovations that we are able to learn about through our work. And so, I think that interest and tangible implications of the kind of investments that we're making is very, very important. For me, I think the biggest challenge is coming from such a large universe of companies. You know, if we think about the breadth of activities that need to change and need to transition, really CO2 emissions and associated pollution problems come from almost all of our global activities, which means that that entire global economy needs to start to adopt clean technology solutions. And that is a very, very broad range of innovation that we are seeing. And for me, I think what's been important is identifying a framework within which to focus, such that what I'm spending my time looking at in detail are the parts of the market that are long-term opportunities with genuinely structurally growing addressable markets. And for me, that's been about identifying the really significant sort of global challenges that we have in this area, which to my mind are how we move people and goods around, how we power the global economy, feed our growing society, and manage what are a fixed supply of scarce natural resources. I think they're the big challenges that we face in achieving a sustainable future. And because they're the significant questions, they are the areas that attract most capital. They are the areas where corporates are prepared to invest to find solutions, because they recognize that over the decades to come, the mainstream economy will need to adopt a cleaner, better way of sort of operating in each of these issues. And that framework I find very, very helpful, because what it means is that I'm looking at companies that are innovating and developing new technologies within areas which I think are relevant for the long term. So it's one of the ways that I sort of try to mitigate some of the obvious fads that you do see in rapidly changing, evolving markets. And then again, it's legwork, it's research, it's time with management teams, it's time usually spent out on the road, but increasingly sort of digitally interacting with industry expertise and sort of understanding the implications of new innovations and the potential value and risks associated with those things. And in order to sort of to build a proper perspective of the businesses that we have available to us. And it's really that work. It's trying to seek out the companies that have a technology which is genuinely differentiated and is genuinely creating a solution that doesn't exist, which can be economically viable for sort of mainstream rational adoption. Because I think it's those businesses that have these positions of leadership in these growth markets that will benefit over the long term. You know, we can all go out and sort of identify businesses that operate in these growth markets, but I think what's important is focusing on which businesses will win in these growth markets, which have a sort of a long-term business model that remains viable, and that's really where we spend the time.
And Amanda, as we were talking before, Brazilians are starting to invest in globally. But basically, most of Brazilians invest directly in most of the mega cap companies, such big techs in the US, FANGs. Why Brazilian investors should add clean energy in their portfolios?
Well, I think there are a few reasons. I mean, firstly, it is different, and obviously to diversify one's exposure, I think is a sort of typically a positive for a client. And I think the clean economy specifically is actually a very good diversifier. You know, we run thematic growth funds that are focused upon some of the structurally growing opportunities that we see globally. And within that, what we're trying to do is identify leading businesses that will win out in the long term, that are differentiated, that have pricing power, that have a sort of a sustainable business model that should translate into margins and free cash flow, and that typically therefore comes with a healthy balance sheet. We're looking for good quality management teams that are operating that opportunity for the benefit of shareholders. So what we feel that we offer with these portfolios is sort of a high quality portfolio of businesses that have a differentiated competitive advantage within these areas of structural growth. But actually that allows us to take exposure to many businesses that are outside of the sort of the big tech universe. So for me, with the clean economy, I'm specifically focused on companies which provide the clean technologies, the products and services that allow the shift. So those big tech companies have net zero targets. They need to buy clean energy. They need to back their growth with sustainable products and services. They're the customers of my holdings, but they will never be my holdings. And so I think the fund is able to sort of to differentiate itself and as I say, offer some diversification to clients. And actually beyond that, you know, it's a strategy that has a very strong bias towards small and mid-cap stocks. This is an area which has been a rich source of alpha for us. It's an area where we feel that sort of legwork and sort of interaction with our management teams is able to give us a competitive advantage here. So I think that's, you know, something that we're very strong in. And then coupled with that, for the clean economy particularly, the fund has a bias towards European innovation. So it's obviously sort of a small mid-cap set of stocks which have European focus. And actually about 25% of the revenues come from emerging markets where there is a huge amount of opportunity to be adopting clean technologies. So I think what the product offers is something that is genuinely different and diversifies for a client that has exposure to the likes of the big tech holdings.
And Jeremy, considering this large exposure in big techs in our portfolios, what are the differences from your digital portfolio to this exposure to big tech names?
Sure, that's a really good question. So when people talk about mega cap tech, the names that spring to mind are those FANG names. So Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google or Alphabet, plus Microsoft, plus the two Chinese tech giants, Tencent and Alibaba. Those names make up less than 20% of the digital economy fund. So to put it another way, 80% of the digital economy strategy is made up with companies which aren't amongst those mega cap names. So if you buy a strategy like this, you're getting exposure to a lot of companies away from those mega cap names. Now, those mega cap names, they're great businesses. They're doing very well. They've got huge opportunities to go after, and they will, I think, continue to be very successful. But there's also so many other opportunities within the digital economy, which can make very successful business models for other companies over the longer term. And that's what that other 80% of the fund is all about. We're getting exposure to cybersecurity. We're getting exposure to real estate infrastructure for e-commerce. We're getting exposure to companies who are providing aspects and tools which businesses around the world need for their digital transformation initiatives, which will lead them into the rest of this decade and beyond. And that's what you're getting exposure to within the digital economy strategy that you wouldn't be getting exposure to if you only focused on owning the mega cap technology firms. So we spend a lot of time drilling into these opportunities. The result is actually about 30% of the overall fund is exposed to small and mid-cap opportunities. So by definition, companies with market caps of less than $25 billion. So these are companies which, typically a lot of people just don't have the resources or the expertise to be able to sort of research thoroughly enough to be able to make an investment in those types of companies, those smaller companies, and feel fully confident about it. But with our resources at AXA Investment Managers, with the approach that we have to sort of hunting around in the smaller cap and mid cap universe, we were able to make those investments with full confidence that we're investing in some very exciting businesses. And actually over the almost 4 years now that the digital economy strategy has been live and running, a lot of the returns that we've actually made for our investors have actually come from the smaller mid-cap universe that we invest in.
And Jeremy, considering this change in the way of how we work and how we interact, what is the future of working from home and how it will affect sectors, as you mentioned, as real estate, leisure, travel, how it will change?
Yeah, it's a really interesting discussion, and it's one that continues to evolve. You know, we felt that some of these changes were already starting to play out prior to the pandemic unfolding last year, and in some ways, the pandemic has sort of just accelerated the discussions, and really sort of almost forced companies to rethink how it allows their employees to engage with their everyday working lives. But we think we're still at a relatively early stage. What we've seen is that actually things can still work with people working from home, and working from home a much larger amount of their time than they have done ever in the past. And we're going to continue to see these changes. You know, for example, some jobs once upon a time, I think there was almost like no appetite for being done at home. So for example, customer services, I think the general expectation was, well, if you're going to be servicing your customers, you have to be in the office, you have to be in the store, or you have to be in a dedicated call center receiving those calls from the customers. And actually what we've seen, one of the things that the cloud has been able to deliver over the last 18 months is very effective contact center technology over the cloud, enabling employees to engage with your clients, continue to service those clients without the need for them to be in a dedicated call center facility. So, you know, we're going to see these sort of changes continue to take shape and take place. There's going to be changes to real estate. There's no doubt about it that companies around the world are now sort of starting to reassess their real estate needs for the future. Now, typically companies enter in fairly long-term contracts for real estate, so these changes aren't going to be made overnight. But as those contracts come up for renewal over the coming years, coming decades, you know, there are changes that are going to be made as a result of the realization that maybe you don't need all that corporate real estate office space as you once upon a time felt you needed. So, you know, there's going to be more and more changes. The fact is that we're going to need more digital connectivity. Broadband becomes even more important. You know, reverting back again to the needs for 5G networks. I think we're also going to start to appreciate that for our working lives as well as our social lives, connectivity, communications become an even more important part of everything going forward.
And Jeremy, in terms of consumption behavior, how will brick and mortar and small neighborhood stores compete in this environment?
Yeah, that's another really interesting question. So, you know, I think, you know, if you're a small neighborhood store, the last thing you want to be doing is trying to be a local version of Amazon. You know, you've got to provide differentiation. You've got to use your locality as an advantage for your business, not just try to replicate something that consumers will increasingly naturally go online first to do. You know, the aspect of being convenient to your potential customer base really comes into play. So you're going to have to think differently. I don't think retail, as it historically sat, works anymore in a bricks and mortar fashion, when increasingly everyone is very comfortable about shopping online, and will do more of that shopping for general merchandise online. So I'll give you an example. In our local neighborhood, one of the stores that opened up in 2020 in the midst of the lockdown was a greengrocer's store. And you know, it was curious because over the last 20 to 30 years, and certainly over the last 20 years, as all the sort of the big supermarkets opened up in their out of town locations, and people started doing their shopping in these big supermarkets, greengrocers were closing their doors, not opening new businesses. And yet this greengrocers has thrived over the last 12 months or so because they've offered a variety of fresh produce in a convenient location for people to go and get that fresh produce on a regular basis. And they've focused on things that you might not necessarily find in your giant supermarkets. So, you know, interesting vegetables, interesting fruits. And I think that there is just generally a bigger appetite out there from consumers to try new things. And to, you know, with a lot of home cooking really coming into play over the last 12 months, being able to get access to interesting vegetables, interesting fruits, has really played into this business's hands. On top of all of that, they offer a little side business, which is fresh fruit smoothies and fresh fruit juices, which they make on the premise to order, which has been a massive hit with all the locals, especially the children. And it's a lot easier to accept from your kids when they want to go to get a fresh milkshake or a fresh smoothie, rather than go to the ice cream store or sort of sweet shop. And so that's been just a massive success for them, attracting a sort of younger demographic, but at the same time, while you take your kids there to get them their fresh fruit juice and, you know, some interesting fruit juices that they sell, you might as well pop into the shop and pick up some interesting things for you to take home as well. So that's the way that local neighborhood stores really have to sort of start thinking about life in the future. Convenience, differentiation, locality, they're the advantages that they have, and that's what they need to use in order to thrive going forward.
About two topics, tech and ESG are two trending topics in our conversations with investors. But Amanda, what we saw over last year and now in 2021, that are the ESG strategy are presenting very strong returns. So I would like to know what are the sectors in your universe that is still attractive.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think what we've seen is the beginning of what will be probably a multi-decade transition in terms of institutions and individuals seeking to recognize some of the risks associated with ESG when making their investments, and simultaneously trying to benefit from what I think will be 30, 40 years of growing demand sort of structurally for cleaner solutions. As a result of that, we have increasingly seen capital deployed into sort of sustainable, clean ESG impact strategies. But I really do think, speaking with clients, that we are quite early on in that shift. Increasingly, I think clients understand the risks associated with being exposed to some areas of sort of stranded assets around the energy transition, and increasingly understand that a sort of a thorough, rigorous ESG analysis of a stock ought to highlight some of the operational and financial risks in a business, and therefore form a legitimate part of making investment decisions from a sort of rational economic standpoint. That's been very helpful for performance for parts of the universe. What we've seen through the course of 2020 and the first half of 2021 has been capital sort of flowing into the space, and that has been supportive of valuations, which on near-term multiples in some parts of my universe now look stretched. But at the same time, I think we've seen a real coming of age from the sector, because actually the other side of what we saw through 2020 was, as CapEx plans from corporates more broadly were falling away, and there was a lack of visibility and a sort of lower willingness and propensity to invest. One of the areas that was extremely resilient in terms of capital being deployed? Well, actually, I would say there were two areas that were extremely resilient, and one of them is the digital world that Jeremy focuses on, and the other was the clean tech energy transition that I focus on. And they were two areas where I think corporates across the board were pretty consistent in recognizing the need to keep investing. And what that means is that we've got greater visibility in terms of the earnings outlook for these businesses, which goes some way towards mitigating that near-term multiple expansion that we've seen. I also think that the pace of adoption of some of these clean technologies has been far more rapid than we might have expected even 18 months ago, as a result of which the addressable markets, the revenue growth, the earnings growth and free cash flow is better than one might have expected, which gives me some comfort around valuations. That said, we really, I think the areas that have seen the most pressure have been things like pure play renewables, so the more obvious parts of the universe, the more obvious beneficiaries. And here we really do have to be selective. I think knowing the universe very well, a lot of these are stocks that I've covered for 20 years. Knowing this universe well, I think helps us here. It also helps us to identify businesses that benefit from that renewables opportunity, but are not necessarily the obvious pure play. So some of the more integrated utilities with really high quality renewables portfolios that were undervalued, I think have sort of continued to look interesting. But actually the fund that I work on, those strategies are deliberately diversified in terms of their opportunity set. So of course we look at renewables within smart energy, but I also invest, as we sort of previously discussed, across low carbon transport. So that's electric vehicles, it's the enablers of electrifying vehicles, but it's also starting to think about hydrogen and electrolyzers for different areas of transportation. And there's a lot of interesting opportunities arising in that part of the market. Within smart energy itself, in addition to the need to adopt renewables, if we're going to do that, but we're going to retain a sort of a resilient grid, as the economy becomes more and more dependent upon electricity, and we are using more and more renewables, there's clearly a discussion around intermittency on the grid and the need for things like battery storage to support renewables such that we can guarantee uptime of the grid. And I think there's a huge amount of opportunity there. The scale actually with which we need to invest in energy storage globally is becoming increasingly apparent. We're looking at roughly a 20-fold increase in energy storage needs over the next 10 years. So there's a huge amount of opportunity there. But I also think there are areas of the universe that have been perhaps slower to take up some of the cleaner, more sustainable solutions that we see. And I think in particular there, I would think about the food supply chain and agriculture, but also the way that we manage our natural resources. So sitting in a market like Brazil, where you have, huge sophisticated growers and an agricultural industry which is extremely advanced, the adoption of precision agriculture has been very, very rapid. And the benefits that are able to accrue from deploying digital solutions to the way that one thinks about irrigation or applying herbicides, pesticides, are very apparent in the Brazilian market, where big companies like Deere have been very, very quick to call out Brazil as being rapid adopters. Actually, interestingly, I think accelerated by the transition of farms to a younger generation, which seems to have been happening quickly. I think it's easy to sit in a market like Brazil and assume that that transition is happening at this pace around the world, but it's not. A lot of the world is quite some way behind. And I think there's huge scope to address both inefficiencies in food production, but also in the food distribution and supply chain, where actually around about a third of the food that we produce globally is still thrown away. So there's a lot that I look at in terms of biological and more sophisticated alternatives to chemicals for preserving food within the supply chain, thinking about more successful ways of packaging and transporting, better cold chains in a lot of the markets that I look at. That's often the reason for some of the food waste. So there's a huge amount happening in that part of the market. Some really, really interesting, innovative businesses that are creating solutions which don't depend upon chemicals, because I think increasingly consumers don't want to see chemicals added to the food production process, quite the opposite. And so I think there's a lot happening there. Same in sort of vertical farming, bringing production of particularly fruit and vegetables back closer to urban centres, depending upon hydroponics and LEDs to grow vertically where space is at a premium, are doing extremely well. And I think that resonates with a broader shift in the way that consumers think about food, and sort of personalizes and brings closer to the end use. And at the same time, some of the businesses that I've been most enthused with in the last 12 months have what I think is a really great business model. They take a hazardous waste that costs their suppliers money to get rid of. So I'm thinking about things like the filings from aluminium production, or cooking oil that's been used by restaurants and needs to be disposed of. That's a cost to businesses that have to get rid of it. And I invest in companies that will take that waste product, and they have a sort of differentiated, often patented technology that they're able to apply in order to produce valuable materials from that. So in the case of aluminium filings and waste, you can produce zinc oxide. Cooking oil you can use to create biodiesels, which have been approved for use in aeroplanes and aviation, as well as road transportation. So you have a valuable product at the end of it, which obviously you can then sell. And in both of those instances, the product is displacing something that's problematic environmentally. So that zinc oxide means you don't have to go and extract virgin zinc, which is used in the galvanizing of steel, but which is an environmentally damaging process in itself. The biodiesel clearly displaces gasoline and petroleum. So yeah, you're looking at a product where you've taken waste, which was a cost, you've created value with it, made something that you're able to sell, and at the same time, you're displacing an environmental problem. And to me, businesses like that have a sort of a huge runway of opportunity and growth as they sort of demonstrate the value of their product, and there's often the superiority of those products. So there's an awful lot of opportunities across a broad range of kind of sustainable transitions where I'm able to find value despite the obvious sort of pricing pressure in a narrow range of pure play renewables. And I think that's the value really that we're able to bring. I think this process of having a framework of understanding where the big long-term opportunities are, and then doing the work to understand which are the best businesses that should be winning across that framework, is really the way that we're able to navigate a cycle and pockets of stretched valuations.
I would like to hear from both of you about carbon emissions. So I'll start with Jeremy. Is digital economy clean?
It is a good question, actually. And I think, there are clearly some good effects and some bad effects from the adoption of the digital economy. I don't think that the data is readily available to the extent where we can sort of make a full judgment on all of this so far. And one of the big problems that we've had is that there's been such a big rush to be to the digital economy over the last 18 months because of the pandemic, that a big part of the digital economy, which has been the delivery of products to people's homes, has had to be done using whichever fleets of vehicles that businesses had already in place prior to the pandemic. So I think, over the years to come, a lot of those fleets will be upgraded and will be transitioned across to being electric vehicles rather than diesel or petrol vehicles. And that will have a massive impact on the numbers that are being used to do the type of analysis with regards to the impact of the digital economy on carbon footprints and on the environment right now. But so I think ultimately, yes, it will be positive for the economy, for the environment, sorry. I think we will learn about better packaging materials over time as well, something else that's probably been a bit rushed over the last 18 months to basically use whatever is to hand to get products shipped in to the end customers. But over time, we will transition to more sustainable packaging as well. But it's been this sort of rush has been over a relatively short period. And a lot of those sort of debates and discussions will take place over the coming months and years, and we will see more improvements around sustainability take place in packaging and transport tied into the digital economy. And that's before you take into consideration the ability to negate the need for people to travel. So that's clearly been a positive side that the digital economy sort of been able to drive for the environment. If people can do more Zoom calls rather than getting on a train or a plane or driving in their car to have those meetings, there's clearly an immediate benefit there for the environment. So net, I would like to say that over all of this comes as a positive impact to the environment, but I think we're just too early to be able to say that empirically in regards to with the data that we have to hand at the moment. But Amanda might certainly have a different view.
Yeah, I mean, I agree entirely with what you say. I think it is early days. Most of the studies that I've read have implied that actually online shopping particularly in developed, and this has been more in developed markets than in some developing markets, is usually significantly lower emission than people going out to bricks and mortar. Obviously, those numbers vary enormously depending upon what you're comparing with, because the difference between somebody walking down the street to their local fruit and veg shop to buy the fruit and veg versus them having got in a car and driven halfway across Rio to go to a sort of a huge hypermarket is vast as a baseline. So I do think it is quite difficult to make those comparisons. Most of them typically suggest that actually already online shopping is better. I think MIT produced a study at the start of this year, largely US focused, suggesting that online was about 36% lower emissions than in-store shopping, which is obviously quite a significant benefit. But as Jeremy said, I think actually a lot of the digital solutions that are available to be deployed that have the potential to improve the environmental footprint of the way that we consume are much more applicable to e-commerce than they would be for us sort of shopping in store. So the process of consolidating deliveries around circular routes and properly planning those routes, that's a digital solution that we need to be using there and need to be using more intelligently. Thinking about the way that vehicles are sort of packed, loaded, how packaging is managed, etc. Ought to significantly improve the emissions profiles from here. And then I think at the same time, there's quite a lot that can be done in terms of incentivizing consumers to accept deliveries on a schedule that is greener. We increasingly see businesses like Ocado that will indicate to a consumer which are the sort of the green delivery slots for them to accept. And I think as we increasingly adopt those kind of practices, there's a lot of scope there for e-commerce to actually improve the environmental footprint of consumption. Obviously, thinking about where we locate fulfillment centres can sort of make further improvements. And as Jeremy says, shifting some of the transportation over to electric. And actually, the equipment that's used within the distribution centres themselves is increasingly becoming electric, and that's a significant step forward. I do also feel very strongly that food waste is a sort of forgotten part of this equation when we're talking about groceries online, because there is certainly scope to reduce food waste quite significantly when we're talking about home deliveries rather than what's sitting out on supermarket shelves being bruised and damaged. And actually, if you take away that third of food waste that we're producing globally, food is 11% of our global emissions. It's also 70% of our water withdrawal. So anything that we can do to mitigate that food waste is a big step forward. As Jeremy says, we need to address packaging. Actually, I don't think that's become a bigger problem because of e-commerce. I just think it's become a more visible problem. It used to be the case that a lot of that packaging and waste was upstream of what we as consumers see, probably sitting out of the back of the hypermarkets and the retailers. And now it's not fitting in our bins at home and sort of sitting, making a mess on the street, and it becomes visible. We don't have the right infrastructure, and I don't think culturally we're accustomed to sorting our waste effectively at home. We do need to address both of those problems, but I'm not completely convinced that actually e-commerce has added to the packaging and recycling issue. I just think it's become more visible, which is arguably a step forward.
As we know, Brazil is a commodity producer country. And Amanda, I would like to hear from you. How can oil companies clean their act? And what is the future for big oil companies and oil producing countries like us, like Brazil?
Well, Brazil is obviously a big oil producing business, sort of economy, but actually Brazil has a lot of resources which are not oil. We've spoken about the agricultural industry. There's obviously a huge wind resource off the north of Brazil. I've spent enough weekends on the coast up there to believe that. And there's a lot of value, I think, that it's possible to extract from that wind resource. And I think as we start to see innovations in things like hydrogen and ammonia, then we will build a better infrastructure for transporting the value of renewable energy. And I think that has the potential to become not just a way to power the domestic economy, which is obviously already relatively clean from an electrification point of view because of all of the hydro assets. But actually, I view that offshore wind resource as being a potential export for the long term. So I think as an economy, I think it's certainly possible to rebalance away from that exposure to some of the obvious resources. And I would view that very positively for the long-term opportunity for the economy. But more broadly than that, there's obviously a really emotive discussion around the role of oil and energy businesses within the energy transition. And I think the first thing that it's important to remember is that right now there is a role for oil companies in the global economy. Speaking as a manager of a clean tech fund that doesn't invest in oil and that mainstream energy, because I don't view it as being a sort of a structural growth opportunity associated with the energy transition, it might sound slightly odd, but even I can see that right now we need plastic, and to make plastic, whilst I come across some wonderful plant-based alternatives, we need oil. We need oil to fuel some of our shipping industries, et cetera, et cetera. And those demands aren't going away in the next sort of 10, 15, probably 20 years. As a result of which, I actually think that the responsible solution is to work with energy companies to encourage them to adopt best practices in terms of their environmental footprint. And that obviously means thinking about the sort of environmental sensitivity of new developments, but it also means thinking about the type of oil that we're producing, the quality of that oil. It means thinking about its applications. It means thinking about making efficiencies in terms of extraction. Clearly, it can mean addressing issues like sort of burning off kind of waste that's coming off fields. Which is not helpful. But broadly speaking, I think we have to recognize the role these companies have to play. I think we have to support best practices within oil and gas production. And then I think over time, as we start to see innovation that can displace oil in more and more applications, and therefore the global demand for oil starts to fall away, then I think it's the time to sort of be encouraging these businesses to take the free cash flow that they are benefiting from and reinvest it. A sort of a very large energy business has a huge skill set that's very relevant for the future. If I look at some of the oil companies that I've covered for years, they have huge understanding of geology, which has the potential for some of our new energy sort of technologies and solutions. The ability to read those sort of geological seismic reports, etc., is very strong. There is a huge amount of project management, of understanding the sort of supply and demand movements within the shorter term and the longer term, which are relevant to building a new energy infrastructure. So I certainly think that there is a role for the skills of major energy businesses. Over time, they will supply less of that global energy demand through oil, and I would think they will supply more of it through alternatives in which I would expect them to be invested. You know, they've strong balance sheets, they understand capital management, they understand project risk, they understand how to develop things offshore. There's a very significant role for these businesses. And I would say, you know, in a market like Brazil, when you think about some of the oil services that have, you know, significant skill sets in terms of managing quite challenging offshore conditions, those skill sets are very, very relevant for things like developing offshore wind. So a role for the future.
Jeremy, in terms of the usage of technology, are we becoming too dependent on tech in our lives? What are the risks?
Yeah, that's another very good question, and you know, something that can provoke a lot of discussion. Yeah, you know, it's, you know, that used incorrectly, clearly there is risks that we become too dependent on technology, and we don't sort of take on the use of technology within a component of our lives, as opposed to sort of letting it dominate our lives. You know, technology, it should enhance productivity, both in our working lives and our personal social lives as well. You know, if you take an alternative to going to the hypermarket and doing your weekly grocery shop, which might take the best part of 2 hours off your day at the weekend, but instead you can do that grocery shop online on your mobile device or your laptop, and it can take 20 minutes. The amount of time you've saved, arguably, you could then spend with your family, your friends. You can spend doing something other than shopping. You could spend, you know, pursuing a leisure activity, enhancing your physical health and your mental health. You know, that's got to be good things if you can go down that route. If instead you use that time that you've saved spending more time on other screens, doing other things, maybe it's not so good. And I think, you know, a big part of this is how we educate people. You know, I try my hardest to sort of to spend as little as time as possible on screens. I try to influence my kids to do the same. And, you know, schools should be educating children at a young age that screens are not where they need to be spending all their leisure time, and that they should be sort of participating in a whole wide range of activities. And, you know, in that way, you know, arguably, you know, the use of technology and the enhancement of productivity can help us lead, you know, more healthier, longer lives. But, you know, it is an education process, and in some ways that a lot of this stuff is so new, it's so interesting, it's hard to put down sometimes when there's always something else to look at. But, you know, that's more an education process than some sort of, I guess, you know, sociology, which needs to kick in to help us all achieve that.
We are running out of time, but I would like to make a very quick question for you, Amanda. How do you see China, and what are the opportunities in this country?
I'm glad you think that's a quick question. Historically, China is obviously an economy which has been heavily dependent upon coal, which actually until recently contributed 70% of the energy it consumed. It's been a major source of employment for the population. And so it was quite problematic to shift away from that. But actually, as the economy has moved towards something more service-based, because the media has focused more and more on air pollution and the health issues, etc., and people have cared more and more, the state was given a mandate to address this. We've seen a massive shift following, I think, the very well-known documentary Under the Dome, which was released in 2015 and really highlighted the scale of the issue. Since then, there's been a huge shift in terms of the public's demand for a cleaner future. The state has picked up on that and has mandated that the 13th five-year plans have really clear policies in place for these kind of issues. So I think within the clean tech universe, there's a huge amount of potential for growth and change. Regulation is becoming clearer and clearer, and it's becoming sort of more investable within these parts of the universe. So there's a lot of opportunity, obviously some question marks and uncertainties still remain, but broadly speaking, I think very interesting.
It was a very insightful conversation. Clean energy, technology will be part of our lives. Amanda, Jeremy, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you ever so much for having us.
Thank you very much, Guilherme.